do have a device with me.
Maybe just hold it up for everybody. So this is actually a world's first, not yet FDA approved. I'll let Jonathan explain where he is in the process here. But why did you put a cell phone chip in a blood glucose meter, and nobody else has done it before you?
Well, as my predecessor in this chair said, for something to work for people, it's got to be as simple as a Kindle. Can't invade people's cell phones, partly because people like to change their cell phones every 6 months. There's always something new. There's always something exciting you want on your cell phone. It takes 2 years to get a medical device cleared through the FDA system. You've got to do clinical trials. You've got to submit the clinical trials. So the people who've tried putting a glucose meter into a cell phone have found that by the time the glucose meter is cleared by the FDA, the cell phone is no longer relevant in the marketplace. We took the opposite approach and said, well, let's put a M2M, a machine-to-machine data chip, into a medical device. It's not a cell phone, although in future models I hope you'll be able to press a red button and talk to a caregiver, but you'll never be able to dial a call on this. It's purely an M2M data device like a Kindle.
So I've got your slide up here, and I'll obviously highlight the connectivity, but what are all the ways the connectivity brings value to a blood glucose meter?
Well, the first thing to do is to bring value to the person using the blood glucose meter without making the person do anything other than they're already used to doing to test their blood sugar. In other words, you put a test strip in the meter, you put a drop of blood on the test strip, you get a number. But now instead of seeing that number, writing it down on a cocktail napkin and talking to your doctor every 6 months, you get immediate feedback from your doctor every time you test, or from some other caregiver. That caregiver may be a disease management call center, may be a diabetes educator, but you're getting immediate feedback and coaching every time you test. So that's the first piece of the value chain. The second, just as Don talked about with the pill cap, is when you're out of supplies, it'll ask you, it'll say, are you ready for more supplies? And if you say yes, they'll come to you in the mail. The third part is really the ability to communicate with the ecosystem of people who help take care of you. Now that's a fancy word, but the easy way to understand it is to remember that behind every child with diabetes stand 2 worried parents. And the scariest day of a parent's life is the day they send their diabetic child to school for the first time and want to know whether that child's going to be okay. So the first place data goes from our server is to the parent's cell phone. Doesn't matter whether it's an iPhone, an Android, a BlackBerry. We can liberate the data from our server in all of those different directions. It also goes to the caregiver's server. Now, increasingly, that caregiver is a disease management call center because the insurance companies know that a patient with diabetes who's in decent control uses more than, or uses $3,500 or more less in medical costs every year. So the insurance companies now have a huge incentive to help people with diabetes control their care, control their blood sugar, and they've set up disease management call centers full of nurses and diabetes educators to do that. Probably the doctor only wants to know about the person who's out of control when they're really out of control and a change needs to be made. But we've enabled the data to go from something that lives inside the glucose meter and typically lives on a paper towel, or the really compulsive people are good at keeping diaries, but they're few and far between, to data that can be used to help take care of that patient every single day.
So interesting that this year's TEDMed, Walt Mossberg, the consumer electronics editor from the Wall Street Journal, who's publicly a diabetic, pulled out a major company's meter and said, this device has nothing to do with helping me manage my care. It gives me a number, but that's it. It really doesn't help me personally manage. You seem to be addressing that issue that Walt has made a big deal out of.
Well, in reality, for most people with diabetes, they go to their doctor, and if their doctor is really set up to manage their diabetes, they chat with the diabetes educator in the doctor's office, and they get 15 minutes of indoctrination, diabetes education, and they even get some from their pharmacist. And they say, well, if your number's this, do that. If your number's this, do that. But what people really need is coaching every day at what the health behavioral people call that teachable moment. That moment where they really need to know what to do next, and they'd like somebody to tell them. To make that happen, you need a connected device.
So, interestingly enough, diabetes blood glucose meters have been around for an awful long time from an awful lot of very big companies. You've gone out and built a brand new meter and made it more costly by putting a cell phone chip in it and added the cost of connectivity. How do you make it all work?
Well, there are a couple of things that Telcare doesn't have that the big companies have. We don't have a corporate jet. We don't have anybody whose salary is even begins to rival the salaries of large companies. So instead, we're putting that same margin into the product, and therefore we're able to bring the product with all of these features to the market at the same price point as the products that are being brought by the big brands.
So to date, I know you've had a number of conversations with health insurers, buyers of healthcare. What's their response been?
Those health insurers who have recognized that engaging their patients with diabetes is critical both to the patient's well-being, but also to their future financial viability as health insurers, have been overwhelmingly positive about this. The challenge for many physicians who practice in their office today is that the doctor has to see a patient, and I am a doctor, so I sympathize with this, has to see a patient in about 6 minutes to keep his office viable. A flood of more data into the doctor's office, unless the doctor is somehow compensated for reviewing that data, is a challenge. The health insurers, on the other hand, are the people who really benefit the most by helping a person with diabetes stay healthy, because they're on the hook for paying for the strokes and amputations and heart attacks and blindness that occur if you don't help people control their blood sugar. They're highly motivated to have this kind of two-way engagement between their disease management program and the patient. Right now, they're paying very expensive nurses to actually sit there on the phone, make outbound phone calls, and ask people, are you testing your blood sugar? What's the number?
So when do we expect to see this on the market, and what distribution channels do you expect to use?
The product is in its final clinical studies. Our objective is to make sure that it's at least as accurate as any glucose meter on the market, and hopefully more accurate than some. And we expect to